Did you know the United States of America invaded Russia? While the world was still at war in Europe in 1918, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson decided he needed to send troops to intervene in a different part of the world, likely in order to protect American investments. The intervention is largely forgotten. According to U.S. Army Historical Foundation, from late summer 1918 to early spring 1920, the United States and other allied nations engaged in combat operations against Bolshevik forces around Archangel in North Russia and around Vladivostok in far-off Siberia. This is an absolutely wild story because you got the English, German, French, Japanese, heck in Canada, I think Australia, sent troops to intervene in Russia, and all of them had different interests and motivations for wanting to intervene in Russia. Some of their reasons were at odds with one another, but to keep it Barney style, here are 4 main possible reasons why this happened, and keep in mind historians still debate this question to this day. Number 1, the Allied powers were worried of Bolshevik influence. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had taken control of Russia after the October Revolution in 1917. He installed a communist government in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They signed a separate peace treaty with Germany in March 1918, ending the war on the Eastern Front, but civil war remained in Russia. In the book Stupid Wars by Ed Strasser and Michael Prince, quote, the U.S. put boots on the ground in Siberia in an attempt to overthrow Lenin and his communist pioneers at the dawn of the Soviet Union. So this falls under the preemptive war category. Now, personally, I think the book Stupid Wars can be a little bit overly cynical at times. When reading through it, they take pot shots at and insults towards some of the soldiers who were involved in the combat, even though they had no say in the matter. But they do a great job of simplifying and putting the story into perspective. So part of the reason for the intervention was the ideology of communism and calls for international revolution raised concerns among Western powers, including the United States, that there was a fear that Bolshevik ideas, communism, could spread to other countries and destabilize the existing order. The second reason was to protect economic interests. American businesses and investments in Russia were at risk due to the revolutionary turmoil. The U.S. government and corporations wanted to safeguard their economic interests, including resources, infrastructure, and trade routes. Third reason was because the Allied powers had been shipping supplies and weapons to Russia since the beginning of the war in 1914. So the U.S. had about $1 billion worth of guns and equipment located along part of the Trans-Siberian Railway near Vladivostok. The Allied powers became concerned when the collapse of the Eastern Front in Russia happened. This collapse and all of the deaths that happened associated with it led to the revolt and civil war in Russia. The Allies were worried those weapons stationed there might be seized by the Germans. The fourth reason was when Wilson sent troops to Russia, the situation at the time looked really bad for the Allies in World War I. Germany had just moved dozens of divisions to France. By spring 1918, the German offensive had actually advanced within artillery range of Paris. This is why they were desperate to reopen the Eastern Front. It's why France and Britain pressured the United States to send forces into northern Russia, to distract them, to distract Germany. There are a lot of different factors at play here, but President Wilson, at least in theory and on paper, wanted to ensure American troops didn't take a side in the ongoing Russian Civil War. Historians in general now, with the benefit of hindsight, see Wilson's decision to send troops to Russia as one of the worst wartime decisions ever made. According to these historians, it foreshadowed other poorly planned American interventions in foreign countries in the centuries since. Nelson, who wrote a book on the subject, really great book titled The Polar Bear Expedition, said, quote, "It didn't really achieve anything. It was ill-conceived. The lessons learned there could have been applied in Vietnam and could have been applied in Iraq." This will not be an exhaustive look at the intervention that I'm doing here. It'll focus on the American experience, the American perspective. The other aspects, like Japan's intervention here, and are important, but outside the scope of this video. I'll mainly be reading from several different books and from a Smithsonian article written by Eric Trickey and an article written by Gibson Bell Smith, Guarding the Railroad, Taming the Cossacks, the U.S. Army in Russia, and the book Stupid Wars that my fiance introduced me to. So, President Wilson signed off on dispatching 13,000 American troops to deploy to Siberia and northern Russia. They'd be outnumbered by 7 to 1 by enemy forces in Russia, so it sounds like kind of a crap posting. He deployed 2 separate expeditionary forces to Russia One was under the command of Colonel George Stewart, and the other under Major General William Graves. Graves is a big part of the story. Graves had been stationed in San Fran during World War I, and then he got even worse orders to fight in Russia. The U.S. soldiers in northern Russia, the U.S. Army's 339th Regiment, was chosen for the deployment specifically because they were mostly from Michigan, so military commanders figured they could handle the war's extreme cold. Their training in England included lessons from a famous Antarctic explorer, Ernest Shackleton, on surviving below zero conditions. Landing in Archangel just below the Arctic Circle in September 1918, they nicknamed themselves the Polar Bear Expedition, probably because it was so cold. According to the U.S. Army Historical Foundation publication, written by historian Lieutenant Colonel Roderick A. Holzer, quote, General Graves met with Secretary of War in the United States Newton D. Baker on the 5th of August 1918. He was provided with a copy of the aide memoir and briefed on Wilson's intent. Before departing, Baker warned Graves, quote, watch your step. You'll be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. And what he's really referencing here is how there's a bunch of different factions, a bunch of different powers at play here, and it's all a powder keg ready to explode. Colonel Stewart, the commander of North Russian forces, was not informed of the aide memoir or briefed on it prior to his departure. He knew nothing about the plan from Woodrow Wilson. He basically was going in there blind. The book Stupid Wars put it this way, quote, the invasion report was unduly influenced by the numerous vague freshman philosophy papers he had graded. Wilson copied their style. Politicians talk theory, generals talk logistics, and Wilson's invasion memoir lacked both. Its main features were its brevity and total lack of detail. They go on to say the memoir was basically saying to invade Russia, but don't cause any trouble, meaning don't get involved in the politics, which seemed impossible in hindsight. For the short amount of planning and preparations, American forces sent to Russia were quickly organized, assembled, equipped, and deployed. Almost 5,000 troops would land in Archangel, and another contingent of over 8,000 troops to Vladivostok at about the same time. The North Russia contingent had lots of engineers but no logistical support, and the Siberia contingent of U.S. troops sent there had logistical support but no engineers. Each organization contained extensive medical assets, though. Some American troops arrived as early as August 15, 1918. Then they quickly took up guard posts along segments of the railway between Vladivostok and Nikolaevsk. The plan was originally for them to help the Czech Legion, but it turned out they were already in control of many sections there. Commander Graves noticed even though the mission originally claimed to want to help the Czech Legion, none were evacuated originally. However, under British command, many of the Polar Bear American troops didn't stay in Archangel to guard the Allied arms cache that they were originally sent to do. British goal was to reach the Russian city of Kotlas, a railroad crossing where they hoped they might use the railway to connect with the cut-off Czechoslovakian Legion in the east. So British officer Lieutenant General Frederick Poole deployed the Polar Bears in long arcs up to 200 miles south of Archangel. From the U.S. Historical Foundation, quote, not long after the American 339th Infantry disembarked and assembled on the docks of Archangel, the British command directed it to immediately move to the front and engage Bolshevik forces. There was no mention of Wilson's aide memoir guarding war material or appropriate chain of command, as the senior American officer in North Russia, and with no instructions to the contrary, Colonel Stewart complied with the British orders. So the 3rd Battalion quickly headed south down the Archangel Railway to engage Bolsheviks, or Bolos as they were frequently called. One of the first combat actions of the 339th Infantry occurred on the 16th of September, resulting in 3 American soldiers being killed. Opposing the Allies were the Bolshevik Red Army, composed of former regulars and the conscripts under the command of Commissar Leon Trotsky. There were over 42,000 Red Army troops in North Russia, supported by 98 pieces of artillery and 378 machine guns. Red Army artillery dominated the battlefield with deadly precision. One U.S. soldier said, quote, what in the hell are we doing here? After a while, we figured we had come out here to keep the Japanese from taking over. The English came over to keep an eye on us, and the French to check on the English, and so on. The Army Historical Foundation goes on stating, quote, the first major battle fought between American and Bolshevik troops occurred on 11th November 1918, the day that the armistice was signed and fighting on the western front of World War I ended. At that time, the Allies in North Russia knew nothing of the armistice. An American platoon commanded by First Lieutenant Harry Dennis was eventually routed during this intense attack. Canadian artillery repulsed subsequent attacks, preventing the Bolsheviks from capturing the main village. During the first 3 days of the battle, the Doughboys and Royal Scots were pushed back, but kept the Bolsheviks at bay with effective fire, machine gun, and artillery fire. The Allies were desperately holding on, taking concentrated fire, outnumbered by the Bolsheviks, who had artillery in the woods and gunboats on the river. The Bolos continued to press their attack, firing more than 4,000 artillery shells during the 4-day battle. Captain Boyd, the senior Allied commander, realized it was only a matter of time before the entire garrison would be overwhelmed. The only chance of holding was to counterattack. So on early morning of the 14th of November, an American platoon commanded by First Lieutenant John Cuddy advanced through the dense forest in knee-deep snow towards the Bolsheviks. The Doughboys attacked with surprise and audacity, forcing the Reds to retreat. Although not to the extent of the fighting on the Western Front, the battle was no less deadly. The Allies suffered approximately 30 killed, 100 wounded, including 7 Americans killed and 23 wounded. The Bolsheviks lost an estimated 500 killed, an unknown number of wounded, and 30 captured. The battle was an eye-opener on a scale the Allies had not expected. American troop morale hit a low point upon hearing of the armistice in Germany being signed and the fighting on the Western Front ending, yet they remained in Russia battling Bolsheviks. The Allies adopted a defensive strategy, while the Bolsheviks became more aggressive. Both sides consolidated their forces and strengthened their positions. The 310th Engineers continued to construct fortified blockhouses throughout the area as Doughboys resumed patrolling the region. The Bolsheviks renewed their attacks in late November, and fighting was widespread along the front. Back in the United States, though, what started to happen was public opinion favored the return of American troops. Following the armistice, this kept growing. Mounting casualties only added to that sentiment back home. By 1918, opposition to Russia deployments grew. Senator Johnson asked, "What is the policy of our nation towards Russia?" He was a progressive Republican from California, and he said in a speech, "I don't know our policy towards Russia, and I know no other man who knows our policy." Johnson, a reluctant supporter of America's entry into World War I, joined with anti-war progressives to build opposition to the Russian mission. Then there was a Bolshevik offensive against American troops in North Russia, which began with deadly attacks on a platoon and attracted attention in newspapers across the United States. For 7 days, the Polar Bears, outnumbered 8-1, retreated north under fire from several villages. The combat was reportedly very different than in Europe. They didn't face off against professional military officers. They were facing bands of militia, disorganized but deadly. From the U.S. Army Historical Foundation, the last major action in North Russia between the Americans and the Bolsheviks was the Battle of Oruzki, fought on the 23rd of March, with subsequent fighting from the 31st March to April 2nd, 1919. The main battle began at 08:30 in the morning on March 31st when the Bolsheviks launched a frontal surprise attack to cut off the main Allied forces from the railway. When the battle was over and all was said and done, the Bolsheviks had lost 2,000 KIA wounded or captured. Secretary of War Baker announced at that point that the American Polar Bear unit would sail home at the earliest possible moment that the weather in the spring will permit, because the sea there at that point was frozen, so they couldn't get in ships to get the Americans out of there. Bolshevik attacks continued through May. The last Polar Bears left Archangel on June 15, 1919. Their 9-month campaign had cost them 235 men. Lieutenant John Cuddy of the 339th Regiment wrote in his book, "When the last battalion set sail from Archangel, not a soldier knew, no, not even vaguely, why he had fought or why he was going now, and why his comrades were left behind, so many of them beneath the wooden crosses." However, that's not the end of the story of U.S. intervention in Russia, because my understanding is that President Wilson was able to keep the other second American contingent, led by Graves, inside Siberia for longer, to use the Trans-Siberian Railway to arm the White Russians. They were called the White Russians, that was the name of their group. They weren't, it's not race. And because he feared that Japan, a fellow Allied nation that had flooded eastern Siberia with 70,000 troops, wanted to take over the region and the railroad. In January 1920, the Bolsheviks began to win the Russian Civil War. The whole thing was becoming a major mess. The American troops had orders not to interfere. The situation was becoming impossible, and so on January 1920, the Wilson administration ordered U.S. troops out of Siberia, citing an unstable civil authority and frequent local military interference with the railway. Graves completed the withdrawal on April 1st, 1920, having lost 189 men. U.S. veterans were not happy about the war. Personally, I think soldiers have an innate sense of when their mission is total foobar. You can just tell, especially once it's all over and you're back home at night, thinking about what you really accomplished versus what you thought you were going to do and what you were told to do. Troops wrote angry letters to Congress. They wrote books titled "Why Did We Go to Russia?" John Casey, director of archives at the World War I Museum, agrees the mission was a waste, stating, "We didn't have clear goals in mind, politically or militarily. We think we have an interest to protect, but it's not really our interest to protect, or at least to make a huge effort at it. Maybe there are lessons we should have learned." It's estimated about 424 U.S. soldiers were KIA and about 1,000 British troops were KIA. Hundreds or thousands of Russian Bolsheviks were KIA. As many as 10 million lives would be lost in the entire Russian Civil War. Commander Graves, in his book at the time, Combat in Russia, wrote, "I was in command of the United States troops sent to Siberia, and I must admit, I do not know what the United States was trying to accomplish by military intervention." After returning home in 1919, these polar bear veterans lobbied state and federal governments to obtain approval and funding to return to Russia and retrieve the bodies of their comrades left behind. In 1929, some former soldiers of the 339th Regiment returned to North Russia to recover the remains of 86 comrades. 45 of them are now buried in Detroit, surrounding a white statue of a fierce polar bear. The U.S. Army Historical Foundation put it this way, quote, "The American soldiers of the 339th Infantry and supporting units in North Russia performed their duties most admirably under a confused and chaotic military political situation. Harshest climactic conditions and deadly combat. When all was said and done, the combat leadership and fighting qualities of American troops were unsurpassed and upheld the finest traditions of the U.S. Army." So I'm not trying to draw any direct parallels between this intervention and any other intervention in U.S. military history. I just think that this story is fascinating. What do you think of this crazy story? Be sure to check out the links in the description because I read straight from the U.S. Army Historical Foundation article written by Lieutenant Colonel Roderick A. Holzer. Check out the Smithsonian article written by Eric. Check out the book Stupid Wars. It's an interesting read, even if I don't agree with everything in here. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon.